The wind howled through the canyon like a wounded animal, carrying with it the sting of alkali dust and the bitter promise of another harsh winter. The year was 1880, and the American frontier stretched endlessly beneath a sky the color of old pewter, its vastness both a blessing and a curse to those who dared call it home. In this unforgiving landscape of red rock mesas and drought-yellowed grass, the small town of Perdition's Creek huddled against the base of the mountains like a collection of weathered bones. The buildings, constructed from whatever materials the land grudgingly provided, leaned into each other as if seeking comfort from the relentless wind. The main street, little more than a rutted track of dried mud, ran between a general store, a saloon with peeling paint, and a handful of other establishments that serviced the needs of ranchers, miners, and drifters who passed through. High above the town, where the mountain slope gave way to a small plateau sheltered by towering ponderosa pines, stood a solitary log cabin. Smoke curled from its stone chimney, the only sign of life in an otherwise desolate setting. This was the home of Elias McCready, though few in town knew his full name, and fewer still dared to speak it. Elias sat on the rough-hewn bench outside his cabin, his weathered hands steady as he cleaned his Winchester rifle. At 58 years old, he moved with the careful precision of a man who had learned that every action costs something. His face, carved by wind and sun into a map of deep lines and permanent squint, told stories that he himself rarely spoke aloud. A scar ran from his left temple to his jaw, a souvenir from the war between the states, where he'd served as a cavalry sergeant until Appomattox. The rifle gleamed dully in the fading afternoon light as he worked oil into the mechanism. It was good work, mindless work that kept his hands busy while his mind wandered paths he'd rather not travel. But the memories came anyway, as they always did when the light began to fail and the shadows grew long. He remembered the weight of a saber in his hand, the screams of horses and men, the acrid smell of black powder smoke. He remembered promises made to dying comrades, promises he'd failed to keep. Most of all, he remembered Sarah, dead these 20 years, taken by the fever while he was away fighting someone else's war. He'd come home to find her grave already grown over with prairie grass, their unborn child buried with her. After the war, he'd drifted west like so many other hollow men, seeking something he couldn't name in the vast emptiness of the frontier. He'd worked cattle drives, ridden shotgun for stage lines, even worn a badge for a time in towns that bloomed and died like desert flowers. But eventually, he'd ended up here, in this cabin he'd built with his own hands, far enough from Perdition's Creek to discourage visitors, but close enough to trade for supplies when necessary. Down in the town, the evening ritual was beginning. Men gathered at the Broken Spoke Saloon to wash the dust from their throats and lie about the day's accomplishments. Women hurried to complete their shopping before dark, clutching their baskets and keeping their eyes downcast. Children were called in from their games, their mothers' voices sharp with the edge of fear that never quite left this frontier. In the saloon, the talk inevitably turned to the hermit on the mountain. "Seen smoke from old McCready's place again today," said Jake Hollis. "A rancher with more debt than cattle. Man's got to be touched in the head, living up there alone like that." "Leave him be," advised Tom Brennan, the barkeep, as he wiped glasses with a gray rag. "Man's earned his solitude, I reckon. Heard tell he was at Shiloh and Antietam both." "Heard tell he's got Apache gold hidden up there," whispered another patron, already deep in his cups. Why else would a man live like that? "Heard tell he killed a dozen men with his bare hands," added someone else. Tom Brennan shook his head. "You boys here tell a lot of things. Man wants to be left alone. I say we oblige him. There's plenty of real trouble in this world without borrowing more." As if to underscore his words, the saloon doors swung open, bringing with them a gust of cold wind and travel dust. The conversations died as men turned to look at the newcomer. Meanwhile, many miles to the east, a different scene was unfolding. A lone wagon bounced and rattled along the frontier trail, its canvas cover snapping in the wind like a sail. On the driver's seat, a young woman gripped the reins with determination that belied the exhaustion etched on her face. Clara Morrison was 26 years old. Though the past 2 years had aged her in ways that had nothing to do with time, her auburn hair, once her pride, was now pulled back in a severe bun beneath a worn bonnet. Her dress, a practical gray wool, bore the signs of hard travel and harder times. But her eyes, green as spring grass, held a fierce light that spoke of unbroken spirit. She had left Kansas City 2 weeks ago with nothing but the wagon, 2 horses, and a determination to put as many miles as possible between herself and the life she'd known. The wedding ring she'd once worn now rested in her trunk, wrapped in black cloth along with a few other mementos of her brief marriage to Daniel Morrison. Daniel. Even thinking his name brought a familiar tightness to her throat. He'd been a good man, a shopkeeper with gentle hands and dreams of prosperity. They'd been married barely a year when the outlaws came. 3 men, faces covered with bandanas, demanding money the store didn't have. Daniel had tried to protect her, tried to be brave. The sound of the gunshot still woke her some nights, after the funeral, after the creditors had taken the store and most of their possessions, after the proper ladies of Kansas City had made it clear that a young widow was either an object of pity or suspicion. Clara had made her decision. She would go west, where the past couldn't follow and where a woman might make her own way without the weight of other people's judgment. The driver she'd hired in Independence, a grizzled former soldier named Willis, had agreed to take her as far as Perdition's Creek for half his usual rate. She suspected it was partly out of pity, partly out of loneliness. He'd been kind enough, sharing stories of his travels and teaching her the basics of handling the team, but she'd caught him looking at her sometimes with an expression that made her uncomfortable. "Storm coming," Willis said now, squinting at the darkening sky. "Big one, by the look of it. We'd best find shelter soon." Clara followed his gaze. The clouds building on the horizon were unlike anything she'd seen in Kansas City. They towered into the sky like mountains themselves, their bases dark as charcoal, their tops catching the last light of the sun in colors of brass and copper. Lightning flickered within them, and the wind was picking up, carrying the smell of rain and something else, something wild and dangerous. "How far to Perdition's Creek?" she asked. "Still a day's ride, maybe more if this storm hits." Willis spat tobacco juice over the side of the wagon. "There's supposed to be an old stage stop about 5 miles ahead. Might still have walls, at least." But 5 miles proved optimistic. The storm struck with a violence that took Clara's breath away. One moment they were rolling along under merely threatening skies. The next, the world exploded into chaos. Wind hit the wagon like a physical force, nearly tipping it. Not rain, but dust came first, a wall of it that turned day into night and filled their mouths and noses with grit. The horses screamed in terror, rearing and fighting the traces. Willis cursed and fought to control them, but a sudden gust caught the wagon cover like a sail. The whole rig lurched sideways, teetered for a heart-stopping moment, then crashed over onto its side. Clara was thrown clear, landing hard in a patch of sagebrush that probably saved her from serious injury. Dazed, she struggled to her feet, calling out for Willis. The wind tore his name from her lips, and the dust was so thick she could barely see her own hands. When the dust finally began to settle, replaced by the first fat drops of rain, she found the wagon. One wheel spun lazily in the air, and her carefully packed possessions were scattered across the desert. The horses had broken free and vanished, and Willis was nowhere to be found. She called until her voice grew hoarse, searched in widening circles until the rain came in earnest, turning the dust to mud and making further searching impossible. Finally, shivering and soaked, she took shelter in the overturned wagon and tried to think. She was alone in the wilderness with the night falling. No horses, no guide, and a storm that showed no signs of abating. Her money was in the wagon somewhere, but finding it in the dark would be impossible. Even if she could right the wagon, which she couldn't, she had no way to pull it. As the last light faded from the sky, Clara made a decision. She'd seen smoke earlier, rising from the mountains. Where there was smoke, there were people. It might be Indians, outlaws, or worse. But staying here meant certain death from exposure. She gathered what supplies she could find, a canteen, some hard biscuit, her shawl, and began walking toward where she'd seen the smoke. The mountain slope was steeper than it had looked from below, and the rain had turned the trail into a river of mud, more than once. Clara fell to her hands and knees, her dress heavy with water and mud. Thunder crashed overhead, and lightning illuminated the landscape in brief, terrifying glimpses. She almost missed the cabin. It was built into the slope so naturally that it seemed part of the mountain itself. But there, blessed sight, was light glowing through an oiled paper window, and smoke still rose from the chimney despite the rain. Clara stumbled to the door and knocked, the sound barely audible over the storm. When no answer came, she knocked again, harder, inside. Elias McCready set down his coffee cup and reached for his rifle. No one came to his door, especially not in weather like this. He moved silently to the window, peering out through a gap in the shutters. What he saw made him frown. A woman, young, from what he could tell, stood at his door. She was alone, soaked through and swaying on her feet. Every instinct told him to leave the door barred. Nothing good came from entanglements with other people, especially women. He'd learned that lesson long ago. But then the lightning flashed again, and he saw her face clearly. Exhausted, frightened, but with a set to her jaw that spoke of determination rather than desperation. And her eyes, even from this distance, he could see the fierce will to survive in those eyes. Against his better judgment, Elias unbarred the door. The door opened slowly, revealing a figure that made Clara take an involuntary step backward. Elias McCready stood in the doorway like a specter from another age, his gray eyes hard as flint, the Winchester rifle held loosely but ready in his hands. The lamplight from inside cast his scarred face in sharp relief, making him appear more phantom than man. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other. Rain cascaded off the small overhang above the door, creating a curtain of water between them. Clara's teeth chattered. Whether from cold or fear she couldn't say, but she forced herself to speak. "Please," she said, her voice barely audible above the storm. "I need shelter. My wagon overturned down below. I have nowhere else to go." Elias studied her with the calculating gaze of a man who had learned to read danger in the smallest details. She was young, alone, and genuinely distressed, not a combination that usually appeared at his door. His instincts warred with each other, the old sergeant who couldn't leave a soul in distress, and the hermit who had learned that isolation was the only true safety. "You alone?" he asked, his voice rough from disuse. "Yes, the driver. I don't know where he went. The horses ran off when we overturned." She swayed slightly, and he noticed how her hands trembled as she clutched her sodden shawl. Thunder crashed overhead, making Clara flinch. Elias made his decision. He stepped aside, lowering the rifle. "Come in then. Quick about it." Clara didn't need a second invitation. She stumbled through the doorway, and Elias shut the door firmly behind her, dropping the heavy bar back into place. The sudden cessation of wind and rain was almost disorienting. The cabin's interior was Spartan but clean. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its fire casting dancing shadows. A simple table and 2 chairs occupied the center of the room, while a narrow bed was pushed against the far wall. Shelves held supplies in neat rows, and Clara noticed the military precision with which everything was arranged. She stood just inside the door, dripping steadily onto the wooden floor, uncertain what to do next. Elias moved past her to add another log to the fire, his movements economical and practiced. "You're making a puddle," he said without looking at her. "There's a blanket in that chest. Get out of those wet clothes before you catch your death." Clara hesitated. The propriety ingrained in her from childhood warred with the practical reality of her situation. She was already shivering uncontrollably, and her wet clothes felt like ice against her skin. Elias seemed to sense her dilemma. He grabbed a rope from a peg on the wall and strung it across one corner of the room, then threw a canvas sheet over it. "There, that'll give you some privacy. I'll heat some water for coffee." behind the makeshift screen. Clara struggled out of her sodden dress with numb fingers. The wool blanket was rough but warm, and she wrapped it around herself gratefully. When she emerged, Elias had his back to her, focused on the coffee pot hanging over the fire. "Sit," he said, gesturing to one of the chairs. "You need to warm up." Clara sat, pulling the blanket tighter. Now that the immediate crisis had passed, she became acutely aware of her situation. She was alone with a strange man in an isolated cabin, with no way to leave and no one who knew where she was. The rifle, now propped against the wall, seemed to dominate the room. Elias poured coffee into a tin cup and set it before her. The liquid was black as tar and bitter enough to make her eyes water, but it was hot, and she drank it gratefully. "Thank you," she said. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't answered the door. Died, most likely." His tone was matter-of-fact, not cruel. "That storm's a killer. Seen plenty of folks who thought they could outlast weather like that. They're buried all along these mountains." He sat across from her, his own cup cradled in his hands. In the firelight, she could see him more clearly. His face was weathered but not unkind, the lines around his eyes speaking of sun and wind rather than just age. The scar that ran down his face was old, long healed into a pale line. His hands, she noticed, were steady and capable, marked with the calluses of hard work. "What's your name?" he asked. "Clara Morrison, Mrs. Clara Morrison." She added the title deliberately, a small shield of respectability. "Widow?" The directness of the question startled her. "Yes, 2 years now." He nodded, accepting this information without comment. "I'm Elias McCready. This is my place." "Do you live here alone?" "I do." Silence fell between them, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the storm's fury outside. Clara found herself studying the room more carefully. Everything spoke of solitary living: one chair, one cup, one plate visible on the shelves, but there were small touches that surprised her. A book of poetry on the mantel, a piece of quartz that caught the firelight, a cavalry saber mounted on the wall with obvious care. "You were a soldier," she said. Not quite a question. "Was, long time ago." "My husband wanted to enlist, but the war ended before he was old enough." She didn't know why she offered this information, except that the silence felt heavy. He was lucky then. Another silence. Clara sipped her coffee and tried to order her thoughts. She needed to be practical, to think about what came next. "Mr. McCready, I need to be honest with you. I have money, or I did, in the wagon, but I can't pay you tonight for your hospitality. When the storm breaks, if you could help me get back to the wagon." "Storm won't break tonight. Maybe not tomorrow either, from the look of it." He stood abruptly, moving to the window. "Your wagon's probably scattered across half the territory by now. Wind like this doesn't leave much behind." Clara felt her heart sink. Everything she owned was in that wagon. Her money, her clothes, the few precious mementos she'd saved from her former life. Without them, she had nothing. "But the stage line runs through Perdition's Creek twice a week," she said, trying to keep desperation from her voice. "If I could just get there." "On foot? It's 15 miles of rough country, and that's if you know the way, which you don't." He turned back to her. "You try to walk it, especially after this storm, and you'll be dead before you make 5 miles. Then what do you suggest I do?" The words came out sharper than she intended. Elias studied her for a long moment. "For tonight? Nothing. You sleep, get warm, let the storm pass. Tomorrow we can see what's to be done." He moved to a trunk in the corner and pulled out a shirt and a pair of worn trousers. "These'll be too big, but they're dry. Better than that blanket for sleeping." Clara accepted the clothes with murmured thanks. Behind her screen, she changed into them, rolling up the legs of the trousers and tying them with a piece of rope. The shirt hung like a tent, but they were warm and dry, and that was all that mattered. When she emerged, Elias had laid out a bedroll near the fire. "You take the bed," he said. "I'll sleep here." "I couldn't. This is your home." "You'll take the bed." His tone brooked no argument. "I've slept in worse places than my own floor." Clara wanted to protest further, but exhaustion was catching up with her. The warmth of the fire, the relief of being safe and dry, and the emotional toll of the day all combined to make her eyelids heavy. She made her way to the narrow bed, which was surprisingly comfortable with its straw mattress and heavy quilts. As she settled in, she watched Elias bank the fire and check the door's bar one more time. His movements were methodical, ritualistic almost, and she realized this was probably his nightly routine, performed exactly the same way for who knew how many years. "Mr. Macready?" she said softly. He paused in spreading out his bedroll. "Yes?" "Why did you let me in? You could have left the door barred." He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "Would have heard you all night if I hadn't. Man needs his sleep." But there was something in his voice that suggested more, a hint of humanity beneath the gruff exterior. Clara pulled the quilt up to her chin and closed her eyes, listening to the storm rage outside. Elias lay on his bedroll, staring at the ceiling. It had been years since another person had been in his cabin, longer still since he'd heard the sound of someone else breathing in the darkness. It stirred memories he'd thought long buried, of shared spaces and companionship, of a life before he'd chosen isolation. He could hear her shifting in the bed, trying to find comfort in unfamiliar surroundings. She was trying to be quiet about it, which for some reason made him almost smile. It reminded him of new recruits on their first night in camp, trying not to disturb the veterans. The storm continued its assault on the mountain. Wind screamed through the canyon below, and occasionally something, a tree branch, perhaps, would strike the cabin walls with a bang that made Clara start. Each time, Elias would hear her breathing quicken, then deliberately slow as she calmed herself. Tough, he thought. Scared but not giving into it. That took strength. As the night wore on, her breathing eventually deepened into sleep. Elias remained awake, his hand resting on the rifle beside him out of habit. Not because he distrusted her, she posed no physical threat, but because 20 years of solitary living had ingrained certain behaviors. He thought about tomorrow and the problem she represented. The sensible thing would be to escort her to town as soon as the weather cleared and wash his hands of the matter. But something told him it wouldn't be that simple. It never was when people entered your life, even briefly. They left marks, disturbances in the carefully ordered existence he'd built. Through the window, lightning illuminated the landscape in stark, momentary tableaus. The storm was moving slow, settling in over the mountains like it planned to stay a while. Could be days before it was safe to travel, days with another person in his space, disrupting his routines, asking questions he didn't want to answer. He turned his head slightly, could just make out her form in the bed, even in sleep. She held herself carefully, taking up as little space as possible. Her hair had come loose from its pins, spreading across the pillow in dark waves that caught the firelight. Beautiful, he thought, then immediately pushed the notion away. He was too old, too damaged for such thoughts. She was young enough to be his daughter, and besides, she was a recent widow. She'd buried a husband, was running from something. The pain in her eyes had been clear enough. Last thing she needed was a broken-down ex-soldier adding to her troubles. Still, as sleep finally began to claim him, Elias found himself wondering what had driven her to risk everything on a wagon headed west. What kind of pain made a woman choose the uncertainty of the frontier over the safety of civilization? And why, despite all his instincts screaming otherwise? Had he opened that door? The fire burned low, casting longer shadows. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the cabin, two solitary souls slept, brought together by chance and weather. Unaware that their lives had just taken a turn neither could have predicted. In her sleep, Clara murmured something, a name, perhaps, or a word of distress. Elias, more asleep than awake, responded to the sound of distress as he once had to wounded soldiers. "Easy now," he whispered to the darkness. "You're safe, and for tonight at least, in this small cabin above Perdition's Creek." She was Clara woke to the sound of movement and the smell of something cooking. For a moment, disorientation gripped her. The unfamiliar ceiling, the strange bed, the clothes that weren't hers. Then memory flooded back. The storm, the overturned wagon, the scarred man who had given her shelter. Pale morning light filtered through the oiled paper window, suggesting the storm had passed. She sat up carefully, aware of her appearance in the borrowed clothes, and found Elias standing by the fire, tending a skillet. "Morning," he said without turning. "Coffee's hot. Breakfast in a minute." Clara finger-combed her hair as best she could, wishing for her brush, her pins, any of the small dignities of civilization, but such wishes were pointless now. She poured herself coffee and sat at the table, watching as Elias divided bacon and biscuits between two plates. "Thank you," she said as he set the food before her. "You're very kind." He made a sound that might have been amusement. Not a word most would use for me. They ate in companionable silence. The bacon was crisp, the biscuits heavy but filling. Clara realized she was hungrier than she'd thought, and cleaned her plate without shame. Survival. She was learning, had little room for delicate manners. "I'll go down to your wagon today," Elias said, pushing back from the table. "See what can be salvaged. I'll come with you." "No need. Rough terrain, and you're not dressed for it." Clara lifted her chin. "Mr. McCready, everything I own in the world is down there. I'm coming." He studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Suit yourself, but you'll do as I say down there. Mountains don't forgive foolishness." He provided her with an old coat and a pair of boots that he stuffed with rags to make them fit better. Thus equipped, they set out into a world transformed by the storm. The landscape that had been hidden by dust and rain the night before now spread before them in stark beauty. Red rock formations rose like ancient sentinels, their surfaces scoured clean. The air was crystal clear, carrying the scent of sage and wet earth. In the distance, snow gleamed on the highest peaks, but the storm's violence was evident everywhere. Trees lay uprooted, their roots clawing at the sky. Deep gullies had been carved by flash floods, and scattered across the slope below. Clara could see the remnants of her former life. The wagon lay on its side, one wheel missing entirely. Boxes had burst open, their contents strewn across hundreds of yards. Clothing fluttered from bushes like strange flags. Papers, including, Clara realized with a sinking heart, her marriage certificate and other documents, were scattered to the wind. They picked their way down carefully, Elias leading with the sure-footedness of long experience. Clara followed, determined not to show weakness despite the way her borrowed boots slipped on the loose rocks. "There," she said, spotting a familiar trunk wedged between two boulders. "That has had my money." Elias helped her free the trunk, but the lock had broken and the contents were soaked. Her carefully saved bills were a sodden mass, illegible and worthless. The few coins that remained clinked mockingly in the bottom. Clara stared at the ruined money, feeling the full weight of her situation crash down upon her. Without funds, she couldn't continue west. She couldn't even return east. She had nothing, no home, no family, no means of support. "It's just paper," Elias said quietly. "You're alive. That's what matters. Easy for you to say." The words came out bitter. "You have a home, a life. I have nothing." He didn't respond, just continued searching through the wreckage. Over the next hour, they salvaged what they could. Some clothing that had stayed relatively dry, a few personal items, a photograph in a cracked frame that Clara clutched to her chest. Of Willis, there was no sign. Probably lit out when the horses ran. Elias said, "Happens sometimes. Men get scared, think only of themselves." "He seemed decent enough," Clara said, though she wondered now if she'd misread him entirely. Most folks seem decent enough until tested. Elias shouldered the bundle they'd made of salvageable goods. "Come on, weather's building again." Indeed, clouds were massing once more on the horizon. They climbed back to the cabin in silence, Clara's mind churning with questions about her future. As they reached the door, she made a decision. "Mr. McCready, I need to be plain with you. I can't pay for your hospitality. I can't even pay for passage to the next town. But I can work." She met his eyes steadily. "I can cook, clean, mend, tend garden. Whatever needs doing, I'll do it to earn my keep until I can find a way to move on." Elias set down the bundle and really looked at her for the first time that day. In the clear morning light, he could see details he'd missed the night before. The determined set of her jaw, the calluses on her hands that spoke of hard work, the way she held herself with dignity despite her circumstances. "I don't need a housekeeper," he said. "Then I'll work in the town. Surely someone needs help." "You don't understand." He gestured at the vast emptiness around them. "Town folks don't take kindly to strangers, especially women on their own. They'll assume things make life hard for you." Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks. She knew what he meant. A young widow, penniless and alone. The assumptions would be inevitable and ugly. "Then what do you suggest I do?" she asked for the second time in as many days. Elias was quiet for a long moment. Then he sighed, a sound of resignation. "You can stay here for a spell, till you figure something out. There's work enough if you're serious about earning your keep." Relief flooded through her. "I am. I'm not afraid of hard work." "We'll see." Over the following days, they established an uneasy routine. Clara threw herself into the work with determination, partly from gratitude and partly to prove she wasn't a burden. She scrubbed the cabin from top to bottom, mended clothes that Elias had let deteriorate, organized supplies with an efficiency that made him blink in surprise. For his part, Elias maintained a careful distance. He was polite but remote, answering her questions with minimum words, eating her much-improved meals without comment beyond a nod of thanks. He spent his days as he always had, hunting, checking trap lines, maintaining the property, but now returned to a warm cabin, hot food, and the disconcerting presence of another person. The first real conversation came one evening when Clara discovered the book of poetry on the mantel. "Wordsworth," she said with surprise. "You read poetry?" Elias looked up from the rifle he was cleaning. "That's so strange?" "I suppose I didn't expect. That is, most soldiers I've known preferred dime novels. Most soldiers you've known probably couldn't read at all." He set the rifle aside. "My mother was a school teacher. Made sure I knew my letters before I knew much else." Clara opened the book carefully. The pages were worn. Notes written in the margins in a feminine hand. Was this hers? It was. She recognized the brevity as a wall and didn't push. But something shifted that evening. Elias began to answer her questions with more than monosyllables, and Clara found herself sharing stories of her own childhood in Ohio before she'd moved to Kansas City. One afternoon, while hanging laundry, Clara saw Elias working to repair the fence around his small garden plot. The posts had been damaged in the storm, and he was struggling to reset them alone. Without asking, she went to help, holding the posts steady while he drove them home. They worked in rhythm, no words needed, and Clara felt a satisfaction she hadn't experienced in years. This was real work, necessary work, not the endless social calls and charitable committees that had filled her days as a shopkeeper's wife. "You're stronger than you look," Elias commented as they finished. "My father was a farmer. I know my way around fence posts." He gave her an appraising look. "Tomorrow we'll check the trap lines, if you're up for it." It was the first time he'd offered to include her in his daily routine. Clara nodded, trying not to show how pleased she was. The trap line ran for miles through the mountains, and Clara soon understood why Elias was in such good condition for his age. The terrain was brutal. The altitude theft her breath, but she kept pace, determined not to slow him down. He showed her how to read animal signs, how to set and check traps without endangering herself, how to move quietly through the forest. He was a patient teacher, correcting her mistakes without condescension. "You learn fast," he said as she successfully reset a complicated spring trap. "I had to." The words slipped out before she could stop them. He waited, not pushing but not moving on either. "After Daniel died, I had to learn many things fast. How to run a business, how to deal with creditors, how to survive when everyone expected me to fail." She stood, brushing dirt from her hands. How to know when it was time to leave? What made you choose West? Clara considered the question. I suppose I thought there would be more room here. Room to be something other than what people expected. She gave a rueful laugh. I didn't expect to lose everything before I even arrived. You didn't lose everything, Elias said quietly. You're still standing, still fighting. That counts for something. That evening, as they shared the rabbits they'd caught, Clara found herself studying Elias when she thought he wasn't looking. The harsh lines of his face had softened slightly over the past week. He moved easier around her now, no longer tensing when she entered a room. Can I ask about the scar? She said suddenly. His hand went unconsciously to his face. Shiloh, second day, rebel cavalry saber. It must have been terrible. It was. He set down his fork. But not for the reasons you might think. The boy who gave me this, he couldn't have been more than 16. I can still see his face when I close my eyes. Just a scared kid doing what he was told. Did he? Die? Yes, they all died, one way or another. Even those who walked away. He stood abruptly. I'm going to check the horses. Clara watched him go, understanding a little more about the weight he carried. She'd lost a husband, but he'd lost pieces of himself on those battlefields, pieces that could never be recovered. When he returned, she had tea waiting, a luxury from her salvaged supplies. They sat by the fire, the silence more comfortable now. I'm sorry, she said. I shouldn't have asked. No, it's been a long time since anyone asked, since I talked about it. He stared into the flames. Sometimes I think that's why I came up here. Not to forget, but to stop remembering so hard. Does it work? No, but it's quieter. The memories don't echo as much. They sat in companionable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Outside, an owl called, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf answered. Play chess? Elias asked suddenly. Clara smiled. My father taught me, though it's been years. He produced a worn set from a shelf, the pieces carved from wood with patient skill. They played slowly, relearning the game together. Clara found herself relaxing, laughing when she made a foolish move, enjoying the gentle competition. Check, she announced with satisfaction. Elias studied the board, then moved his king with a small smile. Mate in 3 moves. What? How? She leaned forward, studying the board, and saw it. Oh, clever. You play with heart. That's good. But sometimes you need to think further ahead. Story of my life, Clara said wryly. As the days passed, the initial awkwardness faded into routine. They developed a rhythm. Morning chores, afternoons hunting or gathering, evenings by the fire. Clara learned to bake bread in the Dutch oven, to preserve meat with smoke and salt, to read weather in the movement of clouds. Town remained a sensitive subject. Elias went alone for supplies, returning with reports of gossip about the hermit's woman. Clara bore it with outward calm, but inside, the old anger simmered. Even here, at the edge of civilization, she couldn't escape judgment. One day, while Elias was hunting, Clara heard horses approaching. She stepped outside to see 3 riders coming up the trail. Her blood went cold when she recognized one of them, a man with the distinctive mismatched eyes she'd last seen wearing a bandana over his face in Daniel's store. Clara's heart hammered as she watched the riders approach. The man with mismatched eyes, one brown, one gray, rode in the middle, flanked by 2 others she didn't recognize. She forced herself to breathe normally, to show no sign of recognition. Maybe he wouldn't remember her. It had been dark in the store, and she'd changed much since then. Afternoon, ma'am, the lead rider said, touching his hat. He was young, perhaps 25, with an easy smile that didn't reach his eyes. We're looking for water for our horses. Mind if we use your well? It's not my well to give or refuse, Clara said carefully. This is Mr. McCready's property. He's not here at present. The mismatched-eyed man studied her with interest. McCready? The old soldier? Didn't know he'd taken a wife. I'm not his wife. I'm working here temporarily. The 3 men exchanged looks that made Clara's skin crawl. The young one dismounted without invitation. Well now, that's interesting. Don't often find a lady working way up here. You must get lonely. Clara took a step back toward the cabin door. Mr. McCready will return soon. Perhaps you should water your horses and move on. Perhaps we should wait for him. The mismatched-eyed man said, also dismounting. Been meaning to pay our respects. Neighborly thing to do. The third man, older and weathered, remained on his horse, but positioned himself to block any escape route. Clara recognized the tactical positioning and felt fear spike through her. I'm sure he'd appreciate that, she said, fighting to keep her voice steady. But he doesn't care for unexpected visitors. He's particular about such things. The young one laughed. Heard that about him? Heard he's touched in the head. That true? Mr. McCready is a good man who values his privacy. Must be real good to have a pretty thing like you keeping house for him. The mismatched-eyed man stepped closer. Say, don't I know you from somewhere? Clara's mouth went dry. I don't believe so. I'm new to the territory. He snapped his fingers. Kansas City. That's it. You had a shop there. I remember now. His smile was predatory. Small world, isn't it? The young one looked between them. You know her, Tate. We've crossed paths, Tate said, his eyes never leaving Clara's face. Her husband had a shop. Nice little place. Shame what happened to him. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. She glanced toward the rifle Elias kept by the door, calculating if she could reach it. Now, Tate said, following her gaze. No need for unpleasantness. We're just talking. Although, he pretended to think. Wasn't there some question about your husband's death? Some said he was mixed up in things he shouldn't have been. That's a lie, Clara said, anger overriding fear. Daniel was an honest man. You know that better than anyone. The words were out before she could stop them. Tate's expression hardened. Do I now? That's an interesting thing to say. The tension stretched taut as a wire. Clara heard her blood pounding in her ears, saw Tate's hand drift toward his gun belt. Then, from the tree line, came the distinctive sound of a rifle being cocked. Step away from the lady. Elias emerged from the forest, his Winchester trained on Tate. He moved with the fluid grace of a predator, positioning himself with clear lines of fire to all three men. Easy there, old-timer, the young one said, raising his hands. We're just being neighborly. Got a strange way of showing it. Elias's voice was cold as winter wind. The lady asked you to leave. I'm not asking. Tate turned slowly, hands visible. McCready, heard about you. They say you were something in the war. War's over. Is it? Some battles keep going. Just change location. Tate's smile was humorless. But we'll go. No harm done. Just wanted to introduce ourselves. We're new to the area. Bought the Jessup place down in the valley. Elias said nothing, the rifle never wavering. The three men mounted their horses with elaborate casualness. We'll be seeing you around, Tate said, tipping his hat to Clara. Ma'am. They rode away slowly, as if they had all the time in the world. Elias kept the rifle trained on them until they disappeared around the bend. Only then did he lower it and turn to Clara. You know him. It wasn't a question. Clara sank onto the porch step, her legs suddenly unable to hold her. He killed my husband. Him and 2 others. They robbed the store and shot Daniel when he tried to protect me. The words tumbled out in a rush. I could never prove it. They wore bandanas, and the sheriff said my identification wasn't enough. But I knew, those eyes, you don't forget eyes like that. Elias sat beside her, the rifle across his knees. Why didn't you say? When they first rode up, I was too shocked and afraid. What if he recognized me first? What if... She buried her face in her hands. I've brought trouble to your door. I should leave. You're not going anywhere. The firmness in his voice made her look up. Men like that are jackals. They sense weakness and exploit it. You run now, they'll follow. But this isn't your fight. It is now. He stood, checking the rifle's action. They threatened you on my land. That makes it my business. Clara studied his face, seeing the soldier surfacing beneath the hermit. You've dealt with men like this before. Too many times. They're always the same. Take what they want, hurt who they please, count on fear to protect them. He helped her to her feet. But fear works both ways. Come on, work to do. Over the next days, Elias transformed the cabin into a defensive position. He reinforced the shutters, created clear fields of fire, set up water barrels in case of fire. Clara helped, learning to load rifles quickly, to watch for movement in the tree line, to think tactically. "Why are you doing this?" she asked one evening as they practiced shooting. "You could send me away, avoid all this trouble?" Elias adjusted her stance, his hands gentle but firm. "Maybe I'm tired of avoiding trouble. Maybe I've hidden up here long enough." He stepped back. Again, "Remember, squeeze, don't pull." The rifle bucked against Clara's shoulder, but the tin can jumped off the fence post. She smiled despite everything. "You're a quick study." Elias said, "Your father teach you to shoot too?" "Some, but I was better with a scattergun. Less need for precision. Sometimes precision matters less than determination." He set up another target. "Tell me about your husband." "What kind of man was he?" Clara was quiet for a moment, reloading the rifle. "Kind, gentle. He loved books more than business. Always had his nose in some volume of philosophy or history. He shouldn't have tried to fight them. It wasn't in his nature. But he did." "Yes." She fired, missed, adjusted. "He knew I was in the store. He couldn't just let them, so he grabbed the old pistol we kept under the counter. They shot him for it." The next shot hit dead center. Elias nodded approval. "He died protecting what he loved. That's not nothing." "Is it enough? He's still dead. They're still free. Justice has its own timeline. Sometimes it needs help finding its way." That night, Clara couldn't sleep. She stood by the window, watching the darkness, remembering. Elias joined her, moving so quietly she didn't hear him approach. "Can't sleep either?" she asked. "Old habit. Always worst before a fight. You think they'll come? Men like that, they've marked you now. Question is when, not if." He was quiet for a moment. "I should tell you something. About why I live up here, away from people." Clara waited, sensing this was difficult for him. "After the war, I drifted. Took work where I could find it. Ended up wearing a badge in a town called Prosperity. Stupid name for a place that had neither prosperity nor hope." He stared out at the darkness. "There was a woman there, Mary, widow, like you. She ran the boarding house where I stayed. We became close." The pain in his voice was old but still sharp. "There was trouble. Local rancher wanted her land. Wanted her. I stood in his way. One night, while I was out on rounds, they came for her, set fire to the boarding house." His hands clenched on the windowsill. "I got there too late. She died in my arms." "Oh, Elias." Clara touched his arm gently. "I killed them. Every man involved. Hunted them down like animals. It didn't bring her back, just added more blood to my hands." He turned to her. "That's why I came here. To get away from what I'd done, what I was capable of doing." "You were grieving, seeking justice. Was I? Or was I just another killer looking for an excuse?" He shook his head. "Either way, I swore I'd never let violence back into my life. But here we are." Clara studied his profile in the moonlight. Maybe this is different. Maybe this is about protection, not vengeance. Maybe. Or maybe violence is like liquor to a drunk. Once you start again, you can't stop. They stood in silence, two damaged souls in the darkness. Finally, Clara spoke. "I don't want you to kill for me, but I won't run anymore either. Whatever comes, we face it together." Elias looked at her, something shifting in his expression. "Together. You've given me shelter, protection, friendship. Let me give you something in return. Let me remind you that violence doesn't have to define you, that there's still good worth protecting." He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "You already have." The next morning brought news from town. Elias returned from a supply run with a grim expression. "They've been busy. Bought out the Jessup place like they said. but also strong-arming other smallholders, building something down there. The sheriff won't move against them. Bought or scared? Does it matter? Elias unpacked supplies with sharp movements. They're consolidating power, making themselves untouchable. Clara felt the old helplessness rising. Just like Kansas City, they take what they want and no one stops them. Someone stopped them from taking you. She looked at him in surprise. He was checking his ammunition. All business. But his words hung in the air between them. "Why didn't you let me go to town last week?" she asked suddenly. "When you went for supplies?" "You know why. Tell me anyway." He set down the ammunition and faced her. "Because those jackals are watching for you. Because the good folks of Perdition's Creek would gossip about the hermit's woman. Because—" He stopped. Because I've gotten used to you being here, to coming home to a warm house and someone who doesn't look at me like I'm broken." The admission seemed to surprise him. Clara felt warmth bloom in her chest. "You're not broken. Scarred. Maybe cautious, but not broken. You don't know all I've done. I know who you are now. That's what matters." They were standing closer somehow. The space between them charged with possibility. Then the moment shattered as horses thundered up the trail. Elias grabbed his rifle, pushing Clara behind him. But the rider who appeared was alone, a boy of perhaps 15, riding hard. "Mr. McCready," the boy called. "Ma sent me. Those new men, they're coming for your place. Tonight. Heard them planning in the saloon." Elias helped the boy down. "How many?" 6, maybe 7. "They were drinking, talking big. Said they were going to clean out the hermit and take what he's hiding." "I'm not hiding anything worth taking." The boy glanced at Clara, then back. "Begging your pardon, sir, but I don't think it's gold they're after." The boy's warning changed everything. Elias sent him back with thanks and a silver dollar for his trouble, then turned to Clara with an expression she'd never seen before, part warrior, part protector, wholly determined. "Pack what you need," he said. "We're leaving." "Running." Clara felt disappointment twist in her chest. "After everything you said about not giving in to fear?" "Not running, choosing our ground." He was already gathering ammunition, checking weapons with practiced efficiency. 7 men in a direct assault on the cabin? Even with defensive positions. Those aren't odds I like, but I know these mountains better than they ever will. Within an hour, they were ready. Clara carried a pack with essentials, while Elias loaded weapons and supplies onto his sure-footed mountain horse. As they prepared to leave, she took one last look at the cabin that had become an unexpected haven. "We'll be back," Elias said, reading her thoughts. "This isn't retreat, it's tactics." They climbed higher into the mountains as the sun began its descent. Elias led them along paths Clara hadn't known existed, through narrow defiles and across ridges that made her heart pound with vertigo, but she followed without complaint, trusting his knowledge of the terrain. As darkness fell, they reached their destination, a natural cave formation Elias had discovered years before. It was defensible, with clear sightlines down the mountain and multiple escape routes if needed. A small spring provided water, and previous visits had left it stocked with basic supplies. "You've prepared for this," Clara observed as Elias lit a small, smokeless fire. "Old habits. Always have a fallback position." He handed her dried meat and hardtack. "Eat, long night ahead." From their vantage point, they could see down to the cabin as full dark settled. Orange lights appeared below, torches moving up the trail. "There they are," Elias said quietly. "Right on schedule." Clara counted the lights. 7, just as the boy had said. Her hands clenched as she recognized Tate's voice carrying up the mountain, giving orders. They watched as the raiders reached the cabin. There was shouting, the crash of furniture being overturned. Then, inevitably, flames began to lick at the windows. "You're home," Clara whispered, touching Elias's arm. "I'm so sorry. It's just wood and stone. Can be rebuilt." His voice was steady, but she saw the muscle jump in his jaw. "Watch. Learn." The raiders milled around the burning cabin, clearly frustrated at finding it empty. Tate's voice rose in anger. Berating his men, they began to spread out, searching the immediate area. Predictable, Elias murmured. Now they'll waste time looking for our trail in the dark. By morning, they'll be tired, angry, and careless. And then we remind them why it's foolish to hunt a hunter in his own territory. They took turns keeping watch through the night. During Clara's shift, she found herself studying Elias's sleeping face in the dim starlight. The years and sorrows that marked him were softened in sleep, and she could see the younger man he'd been. She thought about his story of Mary, of the violence that had driven him into isolation, and understood better the battle he was fighting within himself now. When he woke for his watch, she surprised herself by saying, "I'm not her, Mary. I'm not asking you to avenge me." He was quiet for a moment. "I know. That's what makes this harder. With her, the rage made choices simple. With you," he looked at her directly, "with you, I want to be better than I was." Dawn came slowly, painting the peaks in shades of rose and gold. Below, the raiders had made camp near the smoldering ruins of the cabin. Elias studied them through an old field glass. Sloppy, posted one guard who's already dozing. The others are sleeping off last night's liquor. He lowered the glass. Time to even the odds. He outlined his plan with military precision. Clara would remain hidden with a rifle, providing cover if needed. He would work his way down, using the terrain to remain unseen and deal with the sentries. "No killing unless necessary," Clara said firmly. "I'll do what needs doing. No more, no less." He checked his weapons one final time. "If something goes wrong, you take the horse and ride for town. Don't look back. I'm not leaving you." He smiled then, a real smile that transformed his face. "Stubborn woman. All right, but follow my lead." What followed was a lesson in mountain warfare. Elias moved like smoke through the rocks and brush, using every fold of ground for cover. The drowsy sentry never knew what hit him. Elias's rifle butt dropped him unconscious before he could cry out. Clara watched through the field glass, her heart in her throat, as Elias systematically reduced the odds. Another raider, wandering off to relieve himself, fell to a carefully thrown rock. A third, investigating his companion's absence, met the same fate, but then Tate emerged from his bedroll, instantly alert. His shout roused the remaining men, and suddenly the careful plan dissolved into chaos. Gunfire erupted, echoing off the canyon walls. Clara saw Elias diving for cover as bullets chipped rock around him. Without thinking, she raised her rifle and fired, sending the raiders scrambling for their own cover. "Up there!" one shouted. "He's got help!" The battle that followed was fierce but brief. Caught in a crossfire between Elias below and Clara above, with half their number already down, the raiders found themselves outmaneuvered, one by one. They fell back, dragging wounded companions, until only Tate remained, crouched behind an overturned wagon bed. "McCready," he called out. "This isn't your fight, old man. Send the woman down and ride away. No one else needs to die." "Counteroffer," Elias called back. "You throw out your guns and surrender. Face trial for murder in Kansas City." Tate laughed bitterly. "You know that won't happen. Too many friends, too much money spread around. Even if that widow could identify me. Who'd believe her? I would." The simple statement seemed to catch Tate off guard. Clara saw him shift position, trying to get a better angle on Elias. "You take the word of some woman over mine? You don't even know her. I know enough. I know she's truthful. I know she's brave. I know you're the kind of man who shoots shopkeepers and threatens women." Elias's voice carried clearly. "That tells me everything I need." Clara's chest tightened at his words. She kept her rifle trained on Tate's position, waiting. "You're a fool. McCready. Throwing away your life for what? Some roll in the hay with a desperate widow?" The shot came so fast Clara almost missed it. Elias had moved while talking, circling to an unexpected angle. His bullet caught Tate's gun hand, sending the weapon spinning away. Before Tate could react, Elias was on him. The fight was brutal but short, despite his age. Elias moved with economical violence, every blow calculated. Tate, wounded and off balance, didn't stand a chance. Within moments, he was on the ground, Elias's knee on his chest and a knife at his throat. Clara scrambled down from her position, arriving as Elias spoke quietly to the defeated man. "You're going to confess everything. The murder in Kansas City, the robberies here, all of it. You're going to write it down, sign it, and then you're going to disappear. Take your men and never come back." "And if I don't?" Elias's knife pressed slightly harder. "Then I stop being civilized." Looking into those cold gray eyes, Tate believed him. With shaking hands, he wrote out a confession while Clara watched, her emotions a tangle of relief, vindication, and something deeper she didn't want to examine too closely. When it was done, Elias hauled Tate to his feet. The other raiders, those still conscious, were gathered and given the same choice: leave immediately and never return, or face frontier justice. They chose wisdom. As the beaten men rode away, Elias turned to Clara. "It's done. You're free." She looked at him, this complicated, dangerous, gentle man who had risked everything for her, and felt her heart make a choice she hadn't expected. "Am I?" she asked softly. They stood there in the morning light, surrounded by the evidence of violence, yet somehow finding peace. The ruins of the cabin smoked below them, but Clara found she didn't care. Home, she was learning, wasn't always about walls and roofs. "We should go to town," Elias said finally. "File that confession with the sheriff. Make it official. And," he hesitated, "figure out what comes next." "What do you want to come next?" Clara asked. He was quiet for a long moment, looking at her with those storm-gray eyes that had seen too much, yet still held kindness. "I thought I came up here to die slowly, away from the world, to pay for my sins with solitude." He reached out, tentatively, and touched her face. "Then you knocked on my door and reminded me there might be reasons to live." Clara leaned into his touch. "I was running from death, from failure, from a life that had become a prison. I thought freedom meant being alone." She smiled. "Turns out I was wrong about that too." They made their way back to where the horse waited, gathering what supplies had survived the raid. The cabin was a total loss, but, as Elias had said, it could be rebuilt. Better this time, Clara thought, built for two instead of one. As they prepared to head down the mountain, Clara remembered something. "What you said to Tate about believing me, knowing I'm truthful. How could you know that? We've only known each other a few weeks." Elias helped her onto the horse, then swung up behind her. His arms came around her to take the reins, solid and warm. "Sometimes you just know," he said simply, like recognizing someone you've been waiting for without knowing you were waiting. They rode down toward town in comfortable silence. There would be challenges ahead, rebuilding, dealing with gossip, navigating whatever this thing between them would become. But for now, Clara let herself lean back against Elias's chest, feeling safer than she had in years. As they descended, the sun climbed higher, burning away the morning mist. Behind them, smoke still rose from the ruined cabin. Ahead, the future waited, uncertain but no longer fearsome. "Elias?" Clara said as the town came into view. "Yes?" "That night by the fire, when you said you were too old for love, you never did prove that to me under the stars." She felt his chest rumble with quiet laughter. "Give me time, Clara Morrison, give me time." And time, she thought, was something they now had. Time to heal, time to build, time to discover if what had started in violence and necessity could grow into something lasting and true. The stars would wait for them, patient and eternal, just as they had waited through all the long, lonely years before. The night came suddenly, as it often did in the mountains. They had barely made camp in a sheltered grove when the attack began, not from Tate's men as expected, but from a new group entirely. These were the rest of the gang, the ones who had been away during the first confrontation, returning to find their companions beaten and run off. Clara heard them first, the soft clink of metal on stone that didn't belong to the night sounds. She touched Elias's arm in warning, and he came instantly alert. The transformation from resting man to warrior, immediate and complete. "How many?" he breathed in her ear. She held up 4 fingers, then 5 as another sound reached her. Elias nodded grimly. They were outnumbered and had lost the advantage of preparation. The first shot shattered the night's peace, bark exploding from the tree inches from Clara's head. Then everything erupted into chaos. Muzzle flashes lit the darkness like deadly fireflies as both sides exchanged fire. "Move!" Elias shouted, pushing Clara toward better cover even as he returned fire. His Winchester spoke with deadly authority, and she heard a cry of pain from their attackers. Clara scrambled behind a fallen log, her own rifle ready. The lessons Elias had taught her came back. Breathe steady. Squeeze, don't jerk. Make each shot count. She fired at a shadow moving between trees and saw it stumble. But there were too many, and they were spreading out, trying to flank the defensive position. Elias fought with the skill of long experience, but even he couldn't be everywhere at once. "McCready!" a voice called from the darkness. "We know you got Tate to talk. Can't have that confession reaching town. Nothing personal, just business." Elias answered with his rifle, but Clara could see their situation deteriorating. 2 men were working around their left, another pair to the right. Soon they'd be surrounded. Then she remembered something. The old mine shaft Elias had shown her days ago, warning her away from its dangerous depths. It was close, maybe 50 yards through the trees. An idea formed, desperate but possible. "The mine," she hissed to Elias. "Can we lead them there?" Understanding flashed in his eyes. He nodded, then laid down covering fire while Clara began moving, staying low, using every bit of cover. Elias followed, walking backwards, keeping their attackers' heads down with well-placed shots. The retreat was harrowing. Bullets whined overhead, showering them with splinters and rock chips. Clara felt something hot graze her shoulder but kept moving. Behind them, their pursuers grew bolder, sensing victory. The mine entrance loomed ahead, a darker shadow against the night. Elias grabbed Clara's hand, and they plunged inside just as their ammunition ran low. The shaft was, as she remembered, timber braced near the entrance but unstable deeper in, with rotting supports and treacherous drops. "Back here," Elias whispered, guiding her to a side passage he'd noticed on his earlier explorations. They pressed into the narrow space just as footsteps echoed at the mine entrance. "They went in here," someone shouted. "Got 'em trapped now." Clara held her breath as lights bobbed into view, torches that threw dancing shadows on the rough walls. The outlaws entered cautiously but confidently, believing they had their quarry cornered. "Spread out," their leader ordered. "Check every passage. They can't have gone far." This was the moment. Elias had kept 1 shot in reserve, and now he used it. Not at the men, but at the main support beam he'd identified earlier, the one holding up tons of unstable rock. The rifle's roar was deafening in the confined space. The beam splintered, and for a heartbeat nothing happened. Then, with a groan like a dying giant, the ceiling began to fall. "Run!" someone screamed, but it was too late for those deepest in the mine. Rocks cascaded down. Dust filled the air, and the mountain reclaimed its violated depths with violent authority. Elias pulled Clara deeper into their side passage as debris rained down. The roar seemed to go on forever, punctuated by human cries that were mercifully brief. Then, gradually, silence fell, broken only by the settling of stone and their own harsh breathing. They waited in the darkness, afraid to move, barely daring to breathe. Clara's shoulder throbbed where the bullet had grazed it, and she could feel blood soaking her shirt. Beside her, Elias was a solid presence, his hand finding hers in the blackness. "You're hurt," he said, feeling the wetness on her sleeve. "It's not bad, just a graze. We need to get out, check the entrance." But when they carefully made their way forward, they found their fears realized. The passage was completely blocked, tons of rock sealing them in. Elias examined the blockage by touch, his movements growing increasingly urgent. Clara heard him curse softly, something he rarely did. "How bad?" she asked, though she already knew. "We're sealed in tight. This was the only way out of this section. The darkness seemed to press closer, and Clara fought down panic. To survive so much only to die slowly in the dark. "Hey," Elias said softly, pulling her close. "Don't give up on me now. We've faced worse odds." "Have we?" Her voice was smaller than she'd like. "Well, maybe not worse, but we're together. That counts for something." She felt him moving, heard him striking a match. The brief flare of light showed his face, calm despite their situation. "I've got 3 matches left. We need to search every inch of this passage. Old mines often had air shafts, secondary exits. We just need to find one." They searched methodically, conserving the precious matches, feeling along walls and ceiling for any hint of airflow. Clara's shoulder burned, but she pushed through the pain, knowing their lives depended on thoroughness. It was she who found it, a faint breath of cooler air coming from what seemed like solid wall. But when they investigated with their last match, they discovered boards covering a narrow shaft that angled upward. "Ventilation shaft," Elias said with relief. "Probably comes out on the slope above. It'll be a tight fit, but it's better than dying here." Clara finished. Breaking through the old boards was easier than expected. The wood rotted by decades of moisture. The shaft beyond was indeed narrow, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through, and pitched at a steep angle. "I'll go first," Elias said. "Test the way. If I get stuck, we both go or neither of us does." Clara interrupted. "I'm not waiting here in the dark while you maybe die somewhere up there." He started to argue, saw the set of her jaw, and subsided. "Stubborn woman," he muttered. But she heard the affection in it. The climb was nightmarish. The shaft was rough-hewn, full of projections that caught at clothes and skin. More than once, loose rocks cascaded down, threatening to trigger another collapse. Clara's wounded shoulder screamed protest, but she gritted her teeth and kept climbing, following the sounds of Elias's progress above. Time lost meaning in the darkness. Up became the only direction that mattered. Each foot gained a small victory. Clara's world narrowed to the feel of rough stone under her hands, the burning in her shoulder, and the sound of Elias's encouraging voice. Then, blessedly, she heard him cry out in triumph, "I can see stars! We're almost there!" The last few yards were the hardest, the shaft narrowing even further. Clara felt a moment of pure panic when her shoulders wedged tight, but Elias's hands reached down, strong and sure, pulling her up and through into the glorious open air. They collapsed on the mountainside, gasping like landed fish, covered in dust and blood but alive. Above them, the stars blazed in all their frontier glory, unmarred by any human light. "We made it," Clara breathed, hardly believing it. "We did." Elias was already examining her shoulder by starlight, his touch gentle. "This needs cleaning and bandaging. There's a stream not far." But Clara caught his hands, stilling them. "Wait, just wait." She looked up at him, this man who had become everything to her in such a short time. His face was streaked with dirt and blood from numerous small cuts, his clothes torn, but his eyes were bright with life and something more. "You said you were too old for love," she said softly. A smile tugged at his lips. "I say a lot of fool things. Prove it to me. Prove that you were wrong." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Prove that to me under the stars." For a moment, he just looked at her, and Clara saw in his eyes all the lonely years, all the pain and loss, all the walls he'd built around his heart. Then she saw those walls crumble like the mine behind them. He kissed her then, under that vast canopy of stars, with the mountain wind singing around them and their enemies buried far below. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It carried too much desperate need, too much relief at survival, too much promise of tomorrows they'd almost lost. Clara returned it with equal fervor, pouring into it all the words she hadn't said, all the feelings that had grown despite danger and difference in years. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Elias rested his forehead against hers. "Clara Morrison," he said roughly, "you've turned an old soldier's life upside down." "Good," she replied. "It needed turning." He laughed then, a sound she realized she'd rarely heard from him, full and genuine and free. Come on, let's get that shoulder tended and find somewhere safe for what's left of the night. We still have to reach town. File that confession, start rebuilding. As he helped her to her feet, Clara swayed slightly, exhaustion and blood loss catching up. Elias steadied her, then simply scooped her up in his arms. I can walk, she protested. I know you can. You're the strongest woman I've ever known, but let me carry you anyway. Let me take care of you for once. She relaxed into his arms, her head against his shoulder. Elias. You were wrong about being too old for love. His arms tightened around her. Best mistake I ever made. Saying that brought out your stubborn streak. They made their way down the mountain. Two souls no longer alone, no longer running from the past, but walking toward a future neither had dared imagine. Behind them, the sealed mine kept its grim secrets. Above them, the stars continued their eternal dance. Witness to promises spoken and unspoken, the attack had been meant to destroy them. Instead, it had forged them into something stronger, a partnership tested by fire and sealed with a kiss under the frontier stars. Clara smiled against Elias's shoulder, thinking of all the nights to come when those same stars would watch over them, no longer alone in their light. The journey to Perdition's Creek took most of the next day. Elias had found them shelter in a trapper's abandoned shack where he'd cleaned and bandaged Clara's shoulder properly. By morning light, they'd made their way to where he'd hidden the horse, and now they rode double into town. Clara seated in front of Elias, his arms secure around her as he handled the reins. Their arrival caused an immediate stir. People stopped on the wooden sidewalks to stare at the hermit and his woman, both showing clear signs of battle. Whispers followed their progress down Main Street like ripples on water. Sheriff Ben Walsh was a careful man who'd held his position by knowing when to act and when to look the other way. He received them in his office with the wariness of someone who sensed his comfortable world about to change. "McCready," he said, not offering seats. "Heard there was some trouble up your way. More than some." Elias placed Tate's signed confession on the desk. "Read this." Walsh read slowly, his frown deepening with each line. When he finished, he looked up at Clara. "This true, ma'am? About Kansas City?" "Every word," Clara said firmly. "I couldn't prove it then. Now I can." "Tate's gone," Walsh said, setting the paper aside. "Him and his boys lit out yesterday, heading south, even if this confession's real." "It's real." Elias's voice carried an edge that made Walsh shift uncomfortably. "And there's more. 5 men tried to kill us last night to prevent that confession reaching you. They're buried in a mine shaft up on Eagle's Rest. Self-defense, but I'll swear to it before any judge." Walsh's face had gone pale. 5 men dead? 5 men who chose to become killers. They had options. Elias leaned forward. "Question is, Sheriff, what are you going to do about it? You've got a signed confession to murder. You've got witnesses. You've got a choice to make." The sheriff was quiet for a long moment, clearly calculating political costs. Finally, he sighed and picked up the confession again. "I'll wire the authorities in Kansas City. Get this on record. Can't promise they'll pursue Tate if he's fled the territory, but at least there'll be a warrant." "And locally?" Clara asked. "Others here were hurt by Tate's gang." "I'll investigate." Walsh stood, clearly wanting them gone. "You two planning to stay in town? Long enough to buy supplies?" Elias said, "We've got rebuilding to do." Outside the sheriff's office, Clara felt the weight of eyes upon them. Women clutched their baskets tighter and hurried past. Men lounging outside the saloon made crude comments just loud enough to be heard. "Ignore them," Elias said quietly, steering her toward the general store. But ignoring became harder when they entered Paulson's Mercantile. Mrs. Paulson, a pinch-faced woman who ruled the town's social order with an iron fist, looked Clara up and down with obvious disgust. "We don't serve her kind here," she announced loudly. Elias went very still. What kind would that be? Loose women, widows who take up with men old enough to be their fathers. It's indecent. Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks, but before she could respond, another voice cut through the tension. "Now, Martha, that's no way to talk to folks who just cleaned out that nest of vipers for us." A man emerged from behind the counter. Mr. Paulson himself, obviously less cowed by his wife than appearance suggested. "McCready!" "Ma'am. Heard what happened with Tate's bunch. Town owes you thanks." "Samuel?" "Mrs." Paulson hissed. "Hush, woman. Bad enough we all turned blind eyes while those outlaws robbed folks blind. Won't compound it by turning away decent people." He smiled at Clara. "What can I get you folks?" They purchased what they needed: basic supplies, tools for rebuilding, ammunition to replace what they'd used. Mr. Paulson threw in extra nails for the reconstruction and refused payment for bandages. Seeing as how you got hurt protecting the town, not everyone was hostile. The boy who'd warned them, Tommy Morrison, no relation, despite the name, appeared with his mother, who thanked them personally. The blacksmith nodded respectfully. Even some of the saloon regulars tipped their hats. But the whispers continued, and Clara felt each one like a small cut. As they loaded their supplies, she turned to Elias. "Maybe I should go. Find somewhere else to start over. You don't need this kind of—" "Stop." He caught her hand. "You think I care what dried-up gossips like Martha Paulson think? You think their opinion matters more than—" He paused, seeming to struggle for words. "More than what we have? What do we have? Elias?" The question came out more vulnerable than she'd intended. He looked at her for a long moment. This man of few words and deep feelings. "I don't know all the pretty words. Haven't had cause to use them in 20 years. But I know I was dead inside until you knocked on my door. I know facing down those outlaws meant nothing compared to the fear of losing you. I know I want to rebuild that cabin with rooms enough for 2, maybe more if—" He stopped, color rising in his weathered cheeks. Clara's heart seemed to stop. "If what? If you'd consider making it permanent, official-like." The words came out in a rush, as if he was afraid courage would fail him. "I know I'm too old, too worn down, got nothing to offer but hard work and a scarred-up heart. But—" She silenced him with a kiss, right there on Main Street, in full view of anyone who cared to look. When they parted, she saw wonder in his eyes. "Is that a yes?" "Elias McCready, I'd marry you today if there was a preacher handy." "Actually," a new voice interjected, "there is." They turned to find Reverend Michael Hartley, the circuit preacher, loading his own wagon nearby. He was a younger man with kind eyes and a diplomatic smile. "Couldn't help overhearing," he said. "I'm heading out tomorrow. Won't be back for 2 months. But I've got time today if you're serious." Clara looked at Elias, saw her own wild hope reflected in his eyes. "Are we serious?" "Woman, I've never been more serious about anything in my life." And so, as the afternoon sun slanted through the church windows, Clara Morrison became Clara McCready. Their witnesses were the blacksmith and his wife, Tommy Morrison and his mother, Mr. Paulson over his wife's objections, and a handful of others who'd quietly appreciated the couple's courage. Clara wore her salvaged dress, hastily cleaned and mended. Elias had found a clean shirt somewhere. Neither looked like typical newlyweds, but when Reverend Hartley pronounced them husband and wife, when Elias kissed her with gentle reverence, Clara felt more beautiful than she ever had in her life. The wedding supper at the boarding house was modest but joyful. Mrs. Chen, the proprietress who'd faced her own share of prejudice, prepared a feast. The blacksmith produced a fiddle, and music filled the night. Even some who'd whispered earlier came to offer congratulations, perhaps shamed by the couple's obvious happiness. "Dance with me," Clara said, pulling Elias onto the makeshift dance floor. "I don't dance, haven't in 20 years. "Then it's time you started again." They moved slowly, not quite in time with the music, but perfect in their own rhythm. Around them, the small crowd clapped and smiled, and for a moment the harsh frontier town felt almost like home. "Regrets?" Elias asked softly. "Only that we didn't do this sooner." Clara rested her head on his shoulder. "You?" "None. Except maybe that I can't give you a proper wedding trip. A real home. The things you deserve. She pulled back to look at him. I have everything I need. A husband who fought for me, who sees me as I am, who makes me feel safe and cherished. The rest is just details. Later, as they prepared to leave for the mountain, Mrs. Paulson made one last attempt at causing trouble. It won't last, she announced to anyone within earshot. Mark my words. A young woman and an old man. She'll tire of him quick enough. And then where will they be? Clara had endured enough. She turned to face the bitter woman squarely. You're right about one thing. He is older than me, old enough to have learned the value of kindness. Old enough to know that love is precious whenever you find it. Old enough to have earned every line on his face through courage and sacrifice. Her voice carried clearly. I count myself blessed to be his wife, and if you can't see why, then I pity you. The silence that followed was profound. Then the blacksmith's wife started clapping, joined by others, until Mrs. Paulson retreated in defeat. As they rode out of town in the gathering dusk, Clara sat before Elias on their horse, his arms around her, heading toward their ruined cabin and uncertain future. But her heart was light. That was quite a speech, Elias said, his voice warm with pride and something deeper. I meant every word. I know you did. He pressed a kiss to her temple. My fierce Clara, my wife. The word sent a thrill through her. Wife, after all the loss and running. She was a wife again. But this time was different. This time she'd chosen with her eyes open, knowing the man's flaws and strengths, his past and pain. This time, she'd married not for safety or convention, but for love discovered in the most unlikely circumstances. They reached the burned cabin site as stars began to appear. The destruction was complete, but as they stood surveying the damage, Clara felt no despair. We'll rebuild, she said firmly. Better than before. We will. Elias agreed. Then, with a touch of his old dry humor, though maybe we should put up a sign. No outlaws, bandits, or killers. Trespassers will be shot. Gossips will be ignored. Clara laughed. The sound brightened the mountain air. And what about wandering widows seeking shelter from storms? He pulled her close. There's always room for those, though I'm hoping we've taken in our last one. Count on it, husband. They made camp under the stars, their wedding night spent in the open with the ruins of the old life smoldering nearby. But as Clara lay in Elias's arms, she felt only contentment. Tomorrow they would begin clearing the debris. Tomorrow they would start building anew. But tonight they had each other, and that was wealth enough. The stars, she murmured sleepily. You proved it to me under the stars after all. What's that? Elias asked, already half asleep himself. That you're not too old for love. Though technically, I suppose we proved it together. His arms tightened around her. Together, I like the sound of that. Get used to it, Elias McCready. You're stuck with me now. Best trap I ever walked into. He murmured against her hair. Above them, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, witness to another love story written on the frontier. It had begun with a desperate knock on a door during a storm and led through violence and danger to this quiet moment of peace. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, rebuilding, facing down any lingering threats, creating a life together from the ashes of their separate pasts. But tonight, Clara McCready slept safe in her husband's arms, no longer running, no longer alone. And Elias, the hermit who'd thought himself too old and damaged for love, held his unexpected gift close and thanked whatever providence had sent her to his door. The mountains stood eternal guard around them, and the stars blessed their union with silver light. In the morning, they would rise and work and build, but for now, they rested. Two souls who had found home not in a place, but in each other. Spring arrived with a burst of wildflowers across the mountain meadows, painting the landscape in purples, yellows, and whites. The new cabin stood proud against the backdrop of ponderosa pines, larger and sturdier than its predecessor, with real glass windows that caught the morning light and a covered porch where 2 rocking chairs waited for evening. Clara stood in what would be their garden, her hands deep in the rich soil, planting seeds for the summer vegetables. Her hair was pinned back simply, and she wore a practical dress that had seen better days. But her face glowed with contentment. 6 months of marriage to Elias had brought changes neither had expected, a softening of his harsh edges, a strengthening of her confidence, and a partnership that surprised everyone, including themselves. "You're going to have the best garden in the territory," Elias said, coming up behind her with a bucket of water from the stream. "Our garden," she corrected, smiling up at him. "Though I notice you still prefer hunting to weeding. Man's got to know his strengths," he replied. But he knelt beside her anyway, his hands joining hers in the dark earth. They worked in companionable silence, the kind that comes from knowing someone so well that words become optional. The sun climbed higher, warming their backs, and a hawk circled lazily overhead. "Riders coming," Elias said suddenly, his body tensing in the old way. Clara followed his gaze to see 2 figures approaching on horseback. As they drew closer, she recognized Sheriff Walsh and a woman she didn't know, young, properly dressed, with an official air about her. "Morning, McCready's," Walsh called as they dismounted. "This here's Miss Catherine Palmer from Kansas City. She's got some business with you folks." Clara's heart jumped. Kansas City could only mean one thing. She wiped her hands on her apron and stood, Elias moving protectively closer. Miss Palmer was all business. "Mrs. McCready, I represent the estate of Samuel Worthington. I believe you knew him as one of your husband's customers." "Daniel's customer. Yes, he owns several properties." Clara's mind raced. What could this mean? Indeed. "And it seems Mr. Worthington was quite fond of your late husband. He was disturbed by the circumstances of his death." Miss Palmer produced a leather folder. When Tate's confession reached Kansas City and corroborated what Mr. Worthington had suspected, he took action. He passed away last month, but not before amending his will. Clara accepted the papers with trembling hands. As she read, her eyes widened. "This can't be right. What is it?" Elias read over her shoulder, then whistled low. "That's a considerable sum. $5,000. Clara breathed. "He left me $5,000 as compensation for the terrible injustice suffered by the Morrison family." "There's also this." Miss Palmer handed over another document. "A letter he wrote to be delivered with the bequest." Clara read aloud, her voice catching. "Dear Mrs. Morrison, I was abroad when your husband was killed, or I would have intervened sooner. Daniel was an honest man in a dishonest world, and his death has weighed on my conscience. Please accept this small gesture as both apology and hope that you might find peace and prosperity in your new life. The West needs more couples like the McCreadys, people of courage and integrity. Build something good together. Signed, Samuel Worthington." Tears ran down Clara's cheeks. After all the struggle, all the loss, this unexpected kindness from a near stranger overwhelmed her. "The bank draft can be cashed in Perdition's Creek," Miss Palmer said gently. "Mr. Worthington's instructions were quite specific. The money is yours without condition." After seeing their visitors off, Clara and Elias sat on their new porch, the bank draft between them like a miracle-made paper. "What do we do with it?" Clara asked. Elias was quiet for a moment. "What do you want to do?" "I want to honor Mr. Worthington's wishes. Build something good." She looked out over their land, seeing possibilities. "We could expand, buy some cattle, maybe horses, create something lasting. Ranch work's hard, harder than what we do now. I'm not afraid of hard work." "Are you?" He smiled at the challenge in her voice. "No, ma'am. Just making sure you know what you're choosing." "I'm choosing life," Clara said firmly. "A full life, with you, maybe." She hesitated, then plunged ahead. "Maybe with children to carry on what we build." Elias's hand found hers. "You want children? At my age. Our age doesn't matter. What matters is love, and we have plenty of that." She squeezed his fingers. "Besides, This land needs laughter, little feet running through these meadows, someone to teach all those tracking skills to, and someone to read poetry to," Elias added softly, "to teach about beauty along with survival." They sat in silence, each imagining a future that had seemed impossible just months before. The money would help, certainly, but more important was the partnership they'd forged, tested by fire, strengthened by trust, and sealed with promises under the stars. Over the following weeks, they put their plans into action. They bought a small herd of cattle from a rancher moving east, good stock that would form the foundation of their own herd. They purchased 2 mares and a stallion, planning to breed horses for the cavalry posts that were springing up across the frontier. They hired Tommy Morrison and another young man to help with the work, providing employment for local families who'd struggled under Tate's shadow. The transformation of the hermit's cabin into the McCready Ranch became the talk of Perdition's Creek. Even Mrs. Paulson had to admit, grudgingly, that the couple seemed to be making a success of things. When Clara appeared in town with Elias, heads still turned. But now there was respect mixed with the curiosity. One evening, as summer reached its peak, Clara found Elias standing by the small cemetery they'd created up the hill, a place for memory and honor. He'd installed a marker for his lost Sarah and their child, and Clara had placed one for Daniel. Not graves, but memorials to loves that had shaped who they'd become. "No sadness," Clara said, slipping her hand into his. "They brought us here, in their way." "I know. I was just thinking how different life is now. How full." He turned to her, and she saw wonder in his eyes. "I spent 20 years convinced I was meant to be alone. Now I can't imagine a day without you in it." "Good thing you won't have to." Clara leaned into him. "Though you might want to imagine a few more people in our days." He frowned, not understanding. She took his hand and placed it on her still flat stomach. "By spring, I think, maybe when those wildflowers bloom again." Elias's face transformed, joy, fear, amazement, and love all mingling in his expression. "Clara, are you certain?" "As certain as a woman can be about such things. Are you happy?" For answer, he swept her up in his arms, spinning her around as she laughed. "Happy? I don't have words good enough." He set her down gently, his hands framing her face. "A child, our child, our child," she confirmed, "born to this land we're building together. Born free." As stars began to appear in the darkening sky, they walked back to their cabin hand in hand. Inside, warmth and light waited, the fire crackling, supper on the stove, the evening stretching peaceful before them. Elias retrieved his mother's poetry book, and they settled into their evening ritual of reading aloud, Clara's head on his shoulder, his hand resting protectively over their future. "Read the one about the daffodils." Clara requested, "The baby should hear beautiful words." Elias smiled and found the page, his voice deep and gentle in the quiet room. Outside, the mountains stood eternal guard. The stars appeared one by one, witnesses to the continuation of their unlikely love story. They had traveled far from that stormy night when a desperate woman knocked on a hermit's door. Through violence and prejudice, through doubt and danger, they had found their way to this moment of perfect peace. The cabin that had once housed a man hiding from life now sheltered a family growing toward the future. "I love you," Clara said as the poem ended. "Thank you for proving yourself wrong about being too old for love." "Thank you," Elias replied, "for insisting on the proof." They kissed under their own roof this time, but the stars still blessed them through the windows. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges: ranch work, preparations for the baby, the continuing task of building a life together on the frontier. But tonight, they were complete. The McCready Ranch would grow and prosper in the years to come. Children would indeed run laughing through the meadows. The story of the widow and the warrior would become legend in Perdition's Creek, told and retold with various embellishments, but always ending the same way, with love triumphant and hope restored. But that was all to come. For now, Clara and Elias McCready sat together in their lamplit cabin. reading poetry to their unborn child and each other. Proof that sometimes the most unexpected storms bring the greatest blessings. Under the vast western sky, their love story continued, no longer a tale of loneliness and loss, but of finding home in each other's hearts. The stars kept their eternal watch, and the mountains cradled their happiness, and life was good. Thank you for listening to this story. Dear audience, we'd love to know where you're tuning in from. Please share in the comments below so we can connect with listeners around the world. Don't forget to subscribe to From Wild West channel and let us know your thoughts about Clara and Elias's journey. What touched your heart the most? We can't wait to hear from you.